Thanks to all of you for being here and for joining us via Zoom. And thanks to Rabbi Phil so much for helping out with the technical side. I arrived at OSU in the fall of 1978. Basically, my function was to teach a lot of Western Civ. And I was quite willing to do that. I want to teach Western Civ. But as the time went by, I didn't want to do just that. I wanted to develop some courses that were meaningful to me and that I believed would be meaningful to a lot of students at OSU. Step forward a bit. In the spring of 1982, I was teaching a section of History 103 that is essentially Europe since 1815 and the fall of Napoleon. I had taught it several times before, and I used a book entitled The Varieties of Fascism. And whenever I assigned it, we would have a class discussion based on it. We devote a section of the discussion to talking about Mussolini and Italy and fascism there, et cetera, et cetera. This was a very different discussion that we had that day in 1982. The kids really didn't care about Mussolini. They didn't want to talk about fascism in Italy. They didn't want to talk about Franco and fascism in Spain. They didn't want to talk about fascism in France or the other many countries that were affected by it. They wanted to talk about Nazism and Nazi Germany, but not just some broad view of it. They wanted to hear about the Holocaust. Remind you, I was at the time at something of a disadvantage. I had never had a course on the Holocaust. It just wasn't taught, nor was it taught K-12. Now the world is so much different. And there are hundreds and hundreds of courses on the Holocaust taught at American community colleges. More than half of all states mandate Holocaust education K-12, including Oregon. It is very different world than it was then. But I didn't have that opportunity. I had read some books on the Holocaust. But that day, these students asked me questions about the Holocaust. And finally, one asked me a very special question. He asked, how could the Holocaust have happened? And I knew enough about Jewish history to know that it would be not a very impressive answer to say, well, there was this crazy guy named Hitler, and he caused the Holocaust. And I said, that's it. I knew that to explain how the Holocaust could have happened, I needed to give a lot of background on the history of anti-Semitism. The Holocaust ultimately happened and was as dreadful as it was because of anti-Semitism. And that anti-Semitism was not some new thing that Hitler invented. So I decided pretty much then and there that I was going to teach a course, not just on the Holocaust and its history, going as far back as one can reasonably go in the history of anti-Semitism, tracing it forward. Why was it that the Jews were so hated for so long? That was what my course was from the beginning. Now, mind you, I had a steep learning curve. I had to read tons and tons and tons of books on the Holocaust I actually had a better background for anti-Semitism, but I had to read books on anti-Semitism too. And eventually it became a course I was very proud of. And my students were very, very, very pleased to take. Yes, it was a baccalaureate-core course, but they weren't taking it because they could check off another baccalaureate-core requirement. They were taking it because they were interested. Many of them fascinated. And ultimately, it was that question that got me going. How could the Holocaust have happened? I don't have, unfortunately, the time to really cover the ground that I covered in that course year after year. But what I really want to do in our series of lectures, there will be 2 lectures on the Holocaust itself, and I'll be speaking about the Holocaust other times too. But fundamentally, this course or lecture series is about anti-Semitism and the history of it. We're going to be dealing in depth at the end of the course with what is going on now. And as you all know, we are going through a surge. The numbers are amazing in terms of how big a surge you've had. And by the way, it is not just because of what is going on in Gaza now. The surge really began in 2016. I mean, there are different periods when things were quiet, but since 2016, it has been bad every year, whether there was a war going on involving Israel or not. This is a course in how we got here and what we can do to maybe improve things. Of course, on the Holocaust, there's going to be a lot of dark side. But where it's possible, I'm going to look on the bright side. So you're going to be hearing about the rescuers who risked their lives and sometimes lost them to save Jews. We're going to cover an awful lot over the balance of this year, but for now, I'm just going to get you into today's lecture. The roots of anti-Semitism to the year 1000 of the Common Era, and to take you back to the Holocaust, and take you back to a field near the city of Ivangorod in Ukraine in 1942. I like to think that human nature is going to work against the repetition of an episode as horrific as the Holocaust. But many of us like to be optimistic about human nature and what it can accomplish. The historical record is not what we might like, however. And that's illustrated here. This man here is a member of the SS forces, the Einsatzgruppen, which played a major role in the so-called Holocaust of bullets of 1941-42. This is before the gas chambers, the Holocaust of gas, as historians sometimes refer to it as. But the Einsatzgruppen were responsible for hundreds of thousands and possibly over 1 million deaths of Jews out of the total of roughly 6 million. This shows the Einsatzgruppen man about to shoot a Jewish woman in the back of the head. You can see that she has her right foot off the ground. She is trying to run away to save herself and her toddler. But we can be almost sure that within a few seconds of the taking of this photo, she was dead, and so is the child. When we see some visual evidence like this, we may ponder, what could that man have been like? Oh, he was evil. But then most people are really not evil. So he's an exception to the rule. Or he's crazy. Most people are not crazy. So in either case, he's acting in an aberrant way. Or is it that aberrant? When we look for evidence on human nature as reflected in history, it's not necessarily all that encouraging. Association is basically a lack of true passion. When one sees another person somehow threatened or miserable, terrified, it's not easy to illustrate. There's an awful lot of stuff that is really important about human behavior that is hard to document in anything visual, but I'll try to come as close as I can. With this print showing a public hanging in London around 1800. And if you look up to the scaffold, you can see 3 people. A woman who looks as though she has her hands clasped in prayer. Man facing her, perhaps talking to her, trying to say something soothing, perhaps, or compassionate. And there is another man there. If I look at the crowd, first of all, it's huge. This was a spectator sport for many centuries. And a lot of people there were having a good time. They're running around, some were laughing, some were shouting. It was common at these executions for crowds to jeer those who were about to die because they're not feeling the pain of those who were about to die. Empathy is not necessarily built into us. And in the Holocaust, we find precious little of it. Yes, there were rescuers who risked their lives to assist Jews that they didn't know at all. Just helped them because they were human beings in danger. We will talk about that in a later lecture. But we also see that there were a lot more of those who, like the Einsatzgruppe man, who were perpetrators, and there were rescuers, and topping them both, and by a huge margin, were the bystanders who basically knew what was going on but didn't do anything about it. In shaping human history, okay, I've talked about dissociation. Let's also talk about how people group themselves or are seen in reference to a group. First of all, practically all human beings value some sort of inclusion in groups, including associations. There are many types of associations, so as at least the odds for a linkage to a particular association maybe something physical that we've inherited, skin color is a good example, but there are many others. Something that is going to be with us in all probability throughout our lifetimes that may give us a feeling of kinship for people who share it, or can be something that we grow up with, that causes us to identify with particular groups. Religion would be one of them. Do vary markedly in size and intensity. It can be the group of people who play video games. Maybe they don't even get together to do it. Maybe they never see each other, but they play their video games online. But the size can vary tremendously. That can be just a few people in your family, which may be larger. It can be a nation, which is far larger. It can be casual relationship, or it can be very intense. It becomes intense if there are some influencers, some leaders who are charismatic and who, by example, lay out the idea of, okay, we are such and such a group. This is how it should behave. This is how it should dress. This is how it should think. And do it boldly or not, subtly perhaps. But it's important to get a sense for the impact of these associations, especially those that are fairly large. They have concerns for those who share associations. And associations can be great. They can provide us with identity. They can provide us with friends. They can have a very important impact and a very positive impact on our lives. But in history, we usually see them negatively, or at least we see their impact negatively. They often, members of these associations, accept stereotypes of those who don't share the associations. They see variety within their association, but otherwise they see monoliths. They assume that those other associations are all like that. Ultimately, if we want to understand why there is friction, so much friction in society, look at the associations and why there is more. Look at the associations. It's associations not getting along. We'll talk about compromise and how great compromise is. Well, associations often are not very good at compromise. If we want to understand more, whether we're talking about intrastate or interstate, or look at them, you'll see associations not getting along, associations that hate each other. Why? Nation. We learn a lot about nationalism in this course. It's played a very significant role in the history of antisemitism. class, race, ethnicity, tribe, ideology, religion. These are some large-scale associations. Look at them and you are going to find the causes of so many wars and major acts of violence. On the downside of history, but a very important side to it. And you will certainly find that's very significant in Jewish history. So keep thinking of associations as I give these talks. And I will try to speak to that subject. And with that said, I'm going to get into this course. Talk about the seedbed of the longest hatred. Well, this, by the way, is the title of both a documentary and a book that appeared back around 1990, 1991. The book was written by a fine historian of anti-Semitism named Robert Wistrick, Polish descent, mainly lived in England, wrote a number of books on the history of anti-Semitism in different phases and different periods. Then he put it all together in roughly a 300-page book. The title caught on a great deal. He called this Antisemitism, the Longest Hatred. And that title caught on, and it's become a favorite among historians of anti-Semitism to speak of the longest hatred. And it works. Anti-Semitism is basically the longest hatred, certainly in terms of what it has cost and the length of the period over which it has cost us. And that's what I'm hoping to cover in this lecture series. And I'm going to take us way back to start. Move back. Will be Tanakh or Hebrew Bible, and as I'm pretty aware, there are, perhaps most notably of all, in Genesis and Exodus, onward, Joshua, etc., there is a lot of violence to study. The ancient Jewish world was a very, very violent world for centuries, well over a millennium. Jewish history in this period was a history of attackers and attacked, and sometimes the Jews or Hebrews or Israelites were the attackers, and sometimes they were the attacked, and in some cases they were encouraged to attack the Lord. You see our exploitation from Deuteronomy. After the Jews had been assaulted as they were trying to pass through the lands of Amalek on their way to Canaan, and asked him, please just give us free passage, and apparently he did. But then, instead, he treacherously ordered an attack, and indeed an attack on the rear of the Israelite army. The Jews are then ordered, thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, thou shalt not forget. And then the wars in Canaan, to give you an idea of what it would have looked like, here is the Fertile Crescent. With Canaan, which of course the Israelites were to occupy, the left of this Fertile Crescent, which would bring over toward Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Sumer. There was so much to fight for there. And we can get a quick hint why by noticing that there were a lot of mountain ranges just away from this Fertile Crescent. There was lots of desert too. So you'd have mountains to the north, desert to the south. And then there was the Fertile Crescent. Far and away, most abundant region, and nations fought over it interminably. And so we can talk about attackers in the wars to seize Canaan were very violent, but then the Hebrews or Jews would be confronted by invasions by the Philistines, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. This was just violence. Violence tends to tighten associations, tends to build hatreds, make them more intense. This is a recipe for hatred, and one could surmise, just by the history of human behavior, this going back to 1000 BCE or before is going to cause hatred of Jews or Hebrews is quite intense. I'm going to talk now about Egyptian anti-Semitism. We all know that the Jews at a time were in Egypt. They go there at the end of the book of Genesis, and they return or begin their return in the book of Exodus. We know what the Bible says about this. There is a somewhat different version given by an ancient Egyptian historian, very important one. Probably we can date up to about 4th century BCE, named Manetho, famous for dividing ancient Europe or ancient Egyptian history into dynasties. So Manetho gives quite a different account of the Hebrews' time in Egypt. He refers to a group of conquerors that he calls the Hyksos, Hyksos, the Hyksos, as people who had moved in from the east and who took over, occupied Egypt for several centuries and had finally been thrown out, finally been expelled. Business decisions. A extraordinarily important Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. His start in terms of doing important things, and as a general in one of the Jewish wars against Roman rule, he then became friendly with a Roman emperor. He became very involved with the Romans. He wrote some hugely important books. Josephus read Manetho. In one of his books, he expressed the opinion that the Hyksos were Jews from Canaan, that yes, they had gone into Egypt, but they had not gone peacefully. Rather, they had gone there as conquerors and had occupied Egypt for a while before they returned to their ancestral homeland of Canaan. And he then writes, Egyptians were the first that cast reproaches on us. So in a sense, the first anti-Semites. They hated and envied us because our ancestors had had the dominion over their country. And when they had gone to their own country again, they lived there in prosperity. Also, the difference of our religion from theirs has caused great enmity between us. Okay. He included this comment in a work called Against Appian. Not against Manetho, against Appian. Appian was a Hellenized or sort of a Greekized Egyptian, somewhat older than Josephus, who had written a work in which he attacked the Jews. He attacked the Jews a lot. The Jews, particularly the Jews who were living in Egypt. and particularly in Alexandria, the cultural and I guess we can say the intellectual core of Egypt for several centuries. Alexandria is situated on the Nile Delta. And he takes on this criticism that Appian had leveled at the Jews. He responds in each case to it. So, on this point about religion, he says, Appian objects to us thus. If the Jews be citizens of Alexandria, why do they not worship the same gods with the Alexandrians? I give this answer. Since you are yourselves Egyptians, why do you fight it out one against another and have implacable wars about your religion? He also notes that Appian had denounced Jews to the Romans. He had even told an emperor how terrible the Jews were, and said, and they show you no respect. We have our deified emperors. Our emperors declared gods. But they won't worship their statues. They have no respect for Rome. They just care about themselves. And this is how Appian responds to that. Moses forbade the making of images, like of any living creature, and much more of God. He did not, however, forbid the payment of homage, secondary to that paid to God, to worthy men. Such honors we do confer upon the emperors and the people of Rome. So, we're going to be talking about the question of the Jews as subjects. That is to say, they're living under the rule of a leader who isn't Jewish. How do they behave toward the ruler? Are they good subjects or bad subjects? He is defending them as subjects of the Roman Empire, which by this time they were part of. And now we'll get on to the evolution of a stereotype, which would be a problem for the Jews, one could argue, down to the present. We're going to go way back and spin with us all the time. If we don't get along with other groups, we just care about our association. And we can read about it when we read about the background to Purim. Read about Haman or Haman, and you would know that is a fester of the Persian king. There are many accused who are living in Israel. And a man named Mordecai does not bow down as Haman is coming past one day. And he sees this and he is very upset. People are supposed to bow down to him. This man is not doing it. And he finds out the man's identity, but he doesn't want to just take vengeance on him as an individual. He wants to take vengeance on his people. Finds out that Mordecai is a Jew. He doesn't find that he's related to Queen Esther, but he finds that he's a Jew. And so he goes to the king and he says to him, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from those of every people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it pleaseth not the king to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they be destroyed. Of course, initially the king accepts this, but then Esther gets into the act, and in the end it is Haman who dies, not the Jews. We all always, of course, recall this during Purim. But see the stereotype. The Jews are bad subjects. They do not follow the king's laws. They just care about themselves. Their laws are diverse from those of every people. They're just into themselves. What we will see is it goes on and on. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Talk about Jews and Hellenism. All of the philosophy and culture associated with the period after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. The Jews are living under foreign rulers. The majority of them more. And some of these rulers are very intolerant of them, or Judaism. They're practicing their faith. Some are more tolerant, some are not tolerant. One of those who was not at all tolerant was Antiochus IV, whose base of power was up in Syria, but who also dominated Judea. And Antiochus tries to prevent the Jews from praying in Hebrew, tries to prevent them from following their religion. When they rebel, he sends an army into Jerusalem. There's a great slaughter of Jews. Finally, we see that his armies are defeated by the Maccabees, and of course, we talk every year to remind us of that. We also find that the Jews, particularly the Jews living outside of Judea, are often under pressure from the government or social and cultural pressure from their environment to assimilate. In a way, the Talmud was an answer to this pressure to assimilate. It laid down the laws of just what it meant to be a Jew and what the expectations were and what was proper Jewish behavior and what wasn't, and so it went. The Jews are also stereotyped, notably by Appian, as hating Greeks and things Greek. And this was, again, a very big deal in Alexandria, where many Hellenized Egyptians were very much into Greek culture. Appian tells a story of a case where a Greek, he's from Greece, he's in Alexandria, is found one day in a chamber. He himself is very, very, very obese. And he is surrounded by lots of wonderful food. And one would think he would be kind of happy at this situation, but no, he's terrified because he's learned that the objective of the Jews who had confined him there was to, on a certain day, slaughter him, burn his body, and devour him. And so, not surprisingly, he wants to get out of there. Now we get back to what Josephus had to say. The practice was repeated annually at a fixed season. Jews would kidnap a Greek foreigner, fatten him up for a year, and then convey him to a wood where they would slay him, sacrifice his body with their customary ritual, partake of his flesh, and while immolating the Greek, swear an oath of hostility to the Greeks. This is a very interesting passage because it's the first time, at any rate, that we know of of someone talking about Jewish ritual murder. And we'll see how that develops in the Middle Ages and how dangerous this legend that Jews committed ritual murder would become and how many Jewish lives it would cost. You see, we're seeing the start of accusations and stereotypes back in this early period. But the problem is they continue. And some of them do morph and some of them stay pretty much the same, but they do go on. Okay, I'm going to launch a slide and talk about pagan Roman antisemitism, so pre-Christian or non-Christian. Judea became a client state of Rome in 63 BCE. But basically, it was governed from Rome. And this power over Judea would only increase in the subsequent decades. For a time, the influence of Rome, it was not a very heavy hand, but that would change over time. Many Jews demanded that they wanted to reestablish their freedom. And many Roman emperors cracked down even harder. We have a series of wars by the Jews, conveniently known as the Jewish Wars. We see a noteworthy one in the 60s and 70s of the Common Era, after the Emperor Trajan really tries to crack down on freedom of religion, freedom of practice. There is a massive uprising that goes on from 66 to 73, the Common Era, that sees Roman army under Titus. Titus's armies largely destroy Jerusalem, destroy the Second Temple. They plunder away from the temple. We can see reflected in this famous relief from the Arch of Titus in Rome. Then we have a huge death toll among Jews. It's at the end of this war and one last defeat for the Jews at Masada. That concludes this war. But then there's an even larger one in the 130s that is prompted when the Emperor Hadrian decides, and apparently let it be known, that his intention was to rebuild Jerusalem as a specifically polytheistic or pagan city. Word of this gets back to Judea. A very charismatic individual who's known by his nickname of Bar Kokhba leads a massive uprising against the Romans. Eventually, what is left of Jerusalem is destroyed. Most of Judea is left desolate. Contemporary sources speak in terms of 580,000 Jews killed in this war. Judea was left desolate in the wake of this war. Hadrian bans Jewish practice. He does rebuild Jerusalem, but as a pagan center. Jews are forbidden to enter Jerusalem. They are virtually forced out of Judea itself. It is no longer called Judea, he renames it. This is an important phase, but it's not absolutely the beginning of the phenomenon called the diaspora. This map shows you all Jewish risings and does include certainly the ones around Jerusalem, but elsewhere too. These were all places that were rebelling against Roman rule. So the Jews were doing quite a bit of that. And there are a lot more than just the cases displayed here, but it was a rather common theme. What is happening is that the Jews were being forced out of their ancestral homelands, moving out into the diaspora, places where they're living outside of their homeland. And much of it is in Roman Empire. And this map gives you some idea of their settlement. Attitudes of Romans toward Jews. Not only Romans, but Greeks. They often in their literature refer to the Jews, and not very positively in most cases. And lots of big names here. Cicero blasts Jews. I mean, he really hated them. Cicero is a familiar name to a lot of us. He's not known as an anti-Semite, but boy, he was. I'm going to quote you, though, for you a passage by the super famous, super important Roman historian Tacitus. And what he had to say about Jews. So he is writing late first or early second century of the Common Era. He's into the Christian period, but he is not Christian. He says that the Jews basically care only for themselves. They're interested only in their co-religionists. Quote, the rest of the world they confront with a hatred reserved for enemies. Proselytes, meaning converts to Jewry, adopt the same practices, and the very first lesson they learn is to despise the gods, shed all feelings of patriotism, and consider parents, children, and brothers as readily expendable. Now, this is that same point about Jews not blending in, being very insular, very common stereotype. And believe me, one that is still around. I can say, well, this is a Roman guy, and yeah, it's almost 2,000 years past, but the stereotype is still there, and it is still dangerous. Okay, I am going to talk briefly about the significance of pagan antisemitism. Its significance, I think, is that there was a lot of it. And many of the stereotypes associated with pagan antisemitism were still to be felt many, many, many centuries later, millennia later. So it's good to know them and know what their roots are. Most of us would think of antisemitism as a worldwide problem and be right. But there is too often a tendency to just think of anti-Semitism in terms of Christianity, overwhelmingly Christian issue. It's good to study some other cultures where anti-Semitism was widespread. And so for this too, it's important to study pagan anti-Semitism. With that said, I'm going to go in a different direction. Even though, yes, the Jews were their share of haters, really more than their share, they're not really persecuted once they get out of the Holy Land. They may be disliked, but they're not persecuted for, we'll say after 300 of the Common Era. And then I'm going to read you yet another quotation from Josephus. Just in his longest work, and a very interesting one, Antiquities of the Jews, which is largely a retelling of the history and the Tanakh. Just fascinating. Antiquities of the Jews, he quotes a famous Greek traveler named Strabo, and he quotes a bit from Strabo. Jews are already gotten into all cities, and it is hard to find a place in the habitable earth that hath not admitted this tribe of men and is not possessed by them. We get the impression that actually many Jews were doing fairly well for themselves in the diaspora in these years. Here's some more evidence. This is a fragment of a Roman bowl from about the 4th century of the Common Era. And as you can see, it has plenty of Jewish symbols on it. Jews were noteworthy for their contributions as artisans, as glass blowers, for example, as artists. It's quite possible that the creator of this work was Jewish. It's even more probable that the individual he sold it to, they made it for, was Jewish. Jews not doing as well as Strabo would suggest, but they're doing fairly well for themselves, and little evidence of any real persecution of Jews in the Roman Empire during this period. Okay, well, whether it comes up or not, I'm going to be talking about the early church as a source of anti-Semitism. And on perhaps the ultimate charge against Jews that they were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, for deicide. And this is really a unique charge. You are not going to find on other people being accused of God murder, of God killing. In some polytheistic religions, gods die all the time. They're not immortal. But to kill God, that is just really a charge against the Jews. And certainly, if we're going to go into the history of anti-Semitism, we have to deal with this and note its importance. And talk about the advent of that charge. Okay, to go through it very, very quickly. Jesus arrives, the passion of Jesus rose from his arrival in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, to his visit to the temple where he kicks out the money changers, to the Last Supper with his disciples. I mean, this is all part of the so-called passion of Jesus. But soon he is arrested after having been betrayed. He is arrested, taken into custody by a group of people who have been sent by the Sanhedrin. They also beat him up. He's tried by the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin determines that he should be executed. But they don't have the authority to do that. They have to gain the acceptance of the government of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Anyway, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate by a number of leading Jews, accompanied by the Jewish mob. Pilate interviews Jesus. He asks him if, as his antagonists were saying, he has referred to himself as the king of the Jews. He says, "So I'm told." In other words, he gives an evasive answer. But anyway, they talk for a while. Pilate tells the people, Hebrews who had accompanied him, that he's interviewed Jesus. He seems to be a good man. He's not going to order his execution. And the leaders of the Jews don't like this. The mob doesn't like this. Pilate tries to quiet them. They will not be quieted. Then we get this quotation from the Gospel of Matthew. Pilate, seeing that he was doing no good, but rather that a riot was breaking out, took water and washed his hands in sight of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just man. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. Okay, this portion I've quoted, this is specifically from Matthew. All four of the Gospels discuss aspects of Jesus' passion, an interview with the Pilate, etc. But in a very important way, Matthew is unique. He is the only one who says that this mob says of Jesus, his blood be on us and on our children. Until in some circles today, but certainly far into the 20th century, into the Nazi period and beyond. If people were looking for an excuse for the historical persecution, even the murder of the Jews, that last line, his blood be on us and on our children, is it. The reason it's so important is that the members of this mob are accepting not only their personal support for Jesus' execution, but that it would go on with their children. And indeed, it would soon be interpreted as justification for the idea that what grew into the crucifixion, the death of Jesus, was to be blamed on all Jews for all time, so long as Judaism existed. That's from this line, and it is included only in the Gospel of Matthew, not in the other Gospels. There were so many reminders of Jesus' fate, not just his crucifixion, but here he's being displayed to the members of the mob by Pontius Pilate. He's wearing his crown of thorns. The crowd is jeering him. So many works of art. This was made so visual, as were all aspects of Jesus' last hours. It communicated in so many different ways with audiences for centuries and centuries and centuries. And I'm going to see how it was interpreted by this Dan. John Chrysostom, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople, largely ancestral to the Greek Orthodox Church. And he has dates there, so around 400. He says, the Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God, there is no expiation, meaning atonement, possible, no indulgence or pardon. Again, the Jews, all of them, are the odious assassins, all in his day, all in future days. All Jews for all time responsible for the death of Jesus. And he was very, very far from being the only one who was saying this in his time or from many, many, many centuries later. So certainly the deicide charge, if we're going to talk about the history of anti-Semitism, we've got to talk about that. Another charge for accusation or stereotype that we see evolving in this same period. And again, we can go back to Chrysostom. Jews worship the devil. Now, another interesting thing is that when we see stereotyping of the sort that is ultimately really dangerous, the way a people is imagined, this people is not just seen as the other, they're not like us. Okay, that's not a beneficial attitude for an association to have. But no, in the case of the Jews, they're so often seen as the exact opposite, the polar opposite. So to Christians, well, they worship God, but Jews worship the devil. That's a straight 180 degrees. Total opposite. And that makes it that much more dangerous. Jews worship the devil. As to where this accusation came from, some historians would cite another passage in the New Testament. This one from the Gospel of John. What's happening here, and this is long before the Passion, but Jesus is speaking to a crowd, and there are a group of Jews there who start to heckle him. Anyway, he's being heckled, and he suddenly asks these people, "Who's your father?" And the hecklers respond, "God is our father." And Jesus responds to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires." It's possible that this is the foundation for the belief that Jews were somehow associated with the devil. They worshiped him, they served him, they were his children, they were his progeny. And again, we find this accusation coming down through the ages. This isn't just something where we can talk about in terms of the ancient world, early Christianity. No, it comes down into the 20th, and I don't doubt into the 21st centuries. This linkage of the Jews to the devil. And another comment by Chrysostom, God always hated the Jews. Here there was some disagreement among Christian writers. Some of them believed that God hadn't always hated the Jews, but from the way the Jews behaved toward him, for their disobedience of him, he came to hate them. And then topping it all off was the execution of Jesus, which they had caused, or so the interpretation went. He had turned on them finally. He hadn't always hated them, but he hated them now and would hate them forever. This became a very popular notion with early Christian writers, and again, it would remain so for many centuries. And an early Christian theologian, Origen, he's interpreting Jewish history and the destruction of Jerusalem with that has as its cause deicide and God being furious with the Jews. So it's interpreted in terms of Jewish history. And he says, hence the city where Jesus suffered was necessarily destroyed. The Jewish nation was driven from its country, and another people was called by God, meaning the Christians, to the blessed election. In other words, there was a new covenant, a new Israel. That was the Christians. Judaism also, lots of evidence that it was seen as a rival by early Christians. Here we have a line by Chrysostom. If the Jewish rites are holy and venerable, our way of life must be false. But if our way is true, as indeed it is, theirs is fraudulent. No, it was them or us. And then claims that Jews were somehow endangering the Christian mission, which from a very early date was to Christianize humankind, make the world Christian. And it started with a few Jews, but mainly with polytheists. Anyway, Jews are hindering Christians from speaking to the Gentiles, the polytheists, that they may be saved. Jews are congenital liars who lure Christians to heresy. They should therefore be punished until they confess. Jews as rivals. And we see the church becoming more militant as we pass into and through the 4th century. And as we'll be seeing, this is as the Roman leadership is becoming Christian. There's a very interesting incident in Syria in the early 390s when a Christian mob, incited by their bishop, burnt down the synagogue. And news of this got back to the Roman Emperor Theodosius, and he ordered that the synagogue be rebuilt and that the Christian community pay for it. This becomes really important because it was found, this is Ambrose, another of the 4 doctors of the Catholic Church, takes a stand. He writes to Theodosius, and he tells him that the mob did the right thing. And as a matter of fact, he might consider inciting a mob, and they can burn down a synagogue in Milan, which is where he is the bishop. He then says, there should no longer be any place where Christ is denied. So burn down all the synagogues, and then there'll be nowhere where Christ will be denied. The church leadership is becoming more and more militant. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jew must live in servitude forever. It is incumbent upon all Christians to hate the Jews. You can obviously note what he says. Note what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, let's kill them all. He would have been amazing if he had said that. This point about all Christians should hate Jews, again, it's one or the other. It's a test of faith. Antisemitism is a test of faith. And that would last for a long time too, savagery. Okay, and then we get to a general point. Who are these people who are attacking the Jews, who are assaulting the Jews? They're, at least the ones I've quoted, they're all iconic. They're huge. Chrysostom is not just Saint John Chrysostom to the Greek Orthodox Church, where he has perhaps his main influence. He's also a saint in the Catholic Church. He's also a saint in several Protestant churches. He is huge. He's not just some guy popping off about the Jews. I've been talking about Jerome and about Ambrose as doctors of the church, distinguished as special people in the history of the church, Catholic Church, and of Christianity. One of the founders. You have these New Testament, the authors of the books of the New Testament, like Paul. These are huge people whose words would last for centuries and yet will last down to the present. And their influence would last for centuries and centuries and centuries. and in many cases down to the present. So when you talk about something like anti-Semitism, see what the icons are saying. Those with huge influence in teaching the next generation, influencing the next generation, that hatred passes down through them. We find that church councils take stands that are interesting. The council in Elvira in southern Spain, 306, prohibits marriage and tries to ban all contact between Spanish Christians and Jews. Council in Clermont, in France, 535, decrees that Jews should not hold any position of authority over Christians. Councils in Lyon, early 6th century, commands Christians not to attend Jewish banquets, forbids Jews from appearing in public during the Easter period. The huge, very important council in Nicaea, near Constantinople, decrees in 325 that the date of Easter in a given year should not be fixed in accordance with the date for Passover. And it says, it is becoming beyond measure that on this holiest of festivals, we should follow the customs of the Jews. Henceforth, let us have nothing in common with this odious people. Obviously, there are lots and lots of leading Christians, Christian authorities, etc., who are saying very negative things about the Jews. I would like to talk about more moderate perspectives. If you like to balance things. First, talk about the third of the four doctors of the Catholic Church. This is Augustine, and we have no idea what he looked like. We can just see that painting imagined of him by Botticelli. His philosophy is officially the philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church. And what does he have to say about Jews? The true image of the Hebrew is Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus, and who sells the Lord for silver. The Jew can never understand the scriptures and forever will bear the guilt for the death of Jesus. This doesn't sound very moderate. One of his most famous works. So what makes him a moderate? Augustine decided that the Jews were on a mission from God. They had a mission. And it was important for them to exist so long as they had this mission. And the mission was, ironically, to help convert the world to Christianity. He comments, it is a great confirmation of our faith that such important testimony is borne by enemies, leaving the Jews afoot. For believing Gentiles cannot suppose these testimonies to Christ to be recent forgeries, for they find them in books held sacred for so many ages by those who crucified Christ. What he's basically saying is the Jews, starting with Isaiah, were writing about the Messiah would come, he would do this, he would do that. It would be wonderful for the Jews. They had not recognized Jesus as the Messiah, but nevertheless, in works that the Jews revere, they glorify the Messiah. They just don't accept Jesus as Messiah. So his idea was Jews should continue to exist as Jews because pagans will believe them. Okay. So he says that actually the Jews, although they don't know it, are on a mission, and a very important one. And that after all the Christians come over, all the Gentiles, pagans come over, Jews will come over too. In the meantime, it's important for them to go on as Jews. Well, you know about Cain and Abel. They're the children of Adam and Eve, and that Cain kills his brother Abel. And then God is very angry with him. Not surprising. God is very angry with Cain. But Cain is very angry that he is now, even with one to recognize him as one who killed his father and would murder him. And does a favor to her. It was becoming a commonplace for anti-Semites to say that the Jews were like Cain. They had been responsible for the death of Abel. That was Jesus, their brother. Well, Augustine turns this on its head. He say that they're really like Cain because of the mark, and that Jews are going to be recognized, and they should be thought of as having this mark of Cain on them. Therefore, they should not be the victims of violence. Just as Cain shouldn't be harmed, the Jews shouldn't be harmed, even if they had been responsible for the death of Jesus. The last of the four fathers, one may at least wind up with one more moderate example, and that is, conveniently enough, this man. This is Gregory the First, known as Pope Gregory the First. He is the fourth of the four fathers, four doctors of the Catholic Church. Just as Augustine often criticized the Jews, I quoted that before, and so does Gregory, often condemned Judaism. He tried to cleanse Christian ritual of what he considered to be Jewish practices, generally encouraged the idea of separating Christianity from Judaism, even supported some policies that saw the Jews being persecuted in certain kingdoms of Europe. But, again, we can say, oh, well, what makes him so moderate? Well, he had this red line. Jews, it was not okay to harm Jews, just to get them to convert to Christianity. And mind you, this was in terms of missions, missionary drive, or missionary projects, he is unexcelled among Christian leaders. He was responsible for setting out missions that converted much of Europe to Christianity. Very notably had a huge impact in Britain. The institution of the Archbishop of Canterbury goes back to a mission sent out by Gregory. What makes him so moderate? I'm going to read part of a letter that he sent to the Bishop of Naples while he was Pope, because Jews had complained to him that their services were being disrupted by various Christian mobs, and they weren't able to celebrate their festivals. And here is what Gregory wrote: those who really desire to wend to the true faith, such as are strangers to the Christian religion, should endeavor to effect their purpose by kindly words, not by harsh actions, lest ill treatment should repel those whom just reasoning might have attracted. Those who act otherwise are clearly acting for themselves rather than for God. Do not in future, therefore, allow the Jews to be molested in the performance of their services. Let them have full liberty to observe and keep all their festivals and holy days, as both they and their fathers have done for so long. So again, this idea of not doing any harm to the Jews, that was the red line, and this is what I'm going to wind up for today.